The night my parents kicked me out, they were calm. Too calm. They handed me an empty suitcase and told me I needed to learn independence. What they didn't know was that my grandfather had already prepared me for this moment. In my pocket was an old silver card they'd never noticed, and never asked about. 3 days later, a bank manager locked his office door, stared at his screen, and stopped breathing when he saw the number tied to my name. By the time my parents realized their mistake, the silence they'd created had become very expensive. Growing up, my family never needed to say out loud who mattered more. You could feel it in the way conversations stopped when certain people entered the room, and continued uninterrupted when I did. Decisions were made around me, not with me. I learned early that my role wasn't to be heard, but to adjust. At family gatherings, praise flowed freely, just never in my direction. If I succeeded, it was luck. If someone else did, it was talent. When mistakes happened, mine were remembered for years, retold like cautionary tales. Theirs were brushed aside as learning experiences. No one said it was unfair. They didn't have to. My parents liked control disguised as concern. They framed every boundary they crossed as, "What's best for you?" They chose my classes, questioned my friends, and measured my worth against expectations I was never told I could change. If I pushed back, I was labeled ungrateful. Silence was easier. What hurt most wasn't the strictness, it was the imbalance. My siblings were supported even when they failed. I was scrutinized even when I succeeded. If money was tight, my needs were optional. If praise was scarce, I learned not to expect it. I became independent not because I wanted to be, but because depending on them came with conditions. The house never felt unsafe, but it never felt like mine either. I was a guest expected to behave perfectly to earn my stay. Every argument ended the same way, reminders of everything they'd done for me, and everything I still owed them for it. By the time I was an adult, I understood the unspoken rule of our family. Loyalty flowed upward. Gratitude flowed outward. And questioning either was treated like betrayal. I stopped asking for help long before the night they told me to leave. That's why, when people later asked if being kicked out was a shock, I always shook my head. The suitcase by the door wasn't the beginning of anything. It was just the moment the truth stopped pretending that my grandfather was the only person in our family who never treated love like a transaction. He didn't keep score. He didn't remind you what you owed him. When he showed up, it was because he wanted to, not because it made him look good. He was quiet in a way that made people underestimate him. While everyone else talked over each other at dinner, Grandpa listened. He noticed who got interrupted. Who was ignored. Who quietly passed the bread and never got thanked. He noticed me. When I was a kid, he'd sit beside me on the porch while the rest of the family argued inside. We wouldn't talk much. Sometimes he'd just ask how school was going, or what book I was reading. But when he asked, he actually waited for the answer. No judgment. No correction. Just attention. He never criticized my choices, even when they didn't match what my parents wanted for me. Instead, he'd say things like, "You'll figure it out," or, "Most people don't know what they're doing either." It sounds small, but when you grow up being constantly measured, that kind of acceptance feels huge. As I got older, I noticed something else. Grandpa never shared details about his past. He lived modestly, drove an old car, wore the same watch for decades. If money came up, he changed the subject. My parents assumed that meant he didn't have much. They were wrong, but they never asked, and he never corrected them. The last real conversation we had was short. He was tired, sitting in his chair by the window. When I hugged him goodbye, he pressed something into my hand. A small silver card. No explanation. Just a look and a sentence I didn't understand at the time. "Keep this," he said quietly. "You won't need it right away. But when the day comes that you do, don't hesitate. I asked him what it was for. He just smiled and said, for when people show you who they really are. At the time, I thought he meant emotionally. I didn't realize he meant everything. The night it happened didn't start with yelling. That's what surprised me most. There was no slammed door, no dramatic build-up. Just a heavy quiet that sat in the room long before anyone spoke. We were at the kitchen table. My parents across from me. The same table where homework had been checked and rules had been laid down my entire life. My mother folded her hands like she was about to deliver bad news to a stranger, not her own child. She said it calmly. Too calmly. That maybe it was time I learned how to stand on my own. That I was old enough now. That staying here wasn't helping anyone anymore. Each sentence sounded rehearsed, like they'd practiced it without me. I waited for my father to interrupt. He didn't. He stared at the table, jaw tight, nodding along like this was a business decision. Not a family one. I asked what I had done wrong. The answers came fast, stacked on top of each other. I wasn't grateful enough. I questioned too much. I didn't fit the direction they wanted the family to go. None of it was specific. All of it was final. My mother stood up and disappeared down the hallway. When she came back, she placed a suitcase beside my chair. Empty. A signal, not a suggestion. Just take what you need, she said. You can come back for the rest later. Later never came. I packed in silence. Clothes first. Then my laptop. A few books. Every item felt like proof that I was already living half a life there. When I walked back into the kitchen, my parents were standing. Waiting. No hug. No apology. Just instructions. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Don't blame them. This was for my own good. As I stepped outside, the door closed behind me with a soft click. Not a slam. Something worse. I stood on the porch for a moment, suitcase at my feet, the house still lit behind the windows. From the outside, nothing looked different. But I knew something had ended. What they didn't know was that in my jacket pocket, under my keys, was the small silver card my grandfather had given me. And that night, for the first time, I thought about using it. My parents were certain of one thing as they closed that door behind me: I had nothing. No savings worth mentioning. No safety net. No leverage. In their minds, I was walking into the night with a suitcase full of clothes and a lesson I was supposed to learn the hard way. They'd always underestimated me that way. Not loudly, never openly, but through assumptions that followed me everywhere. They assumed I'd fail without their guidance. That I'd come back apologizing. That independence would scare me into obedience. As I stood on the porch, I could almost hear the conversation they'd have later. How they'd frame it as tough love. How they'd tell relatives I wasn't ready for responsibility. How this was supposed to humble me. They believed I depended on them more than I actually did. They mistook my silence for weakness. My patience for permission. They never saw the hours I spent building my own plans quietly, without asking for approval. They never noticed because they weren't looking. To them, money meant visibility. Flash. Status. If they didn't see it, it didn't exist. I didn't drive a new car. I didn't brag. I didn't ask for help. So they assumed there was nothing beneath the surface. That confidence made their decision easy. They didn't worry about consequences. They didn't imagine alternatives. In their story, I was meant to struggle for a while and then return, grateful for whatever scraps of support they decided to offer. They were wrong about almost everything, but especially about what I carried with me when I left. Because tucked away in my pocket wasn't just a card. It was proof that someone, somewhere, had seen my future very differently than they had. And the moment they chose to push me out, they unknowingly pushed me closer to discovering exactly how wrong they were, that I hadn't thought much about the card in a long time. It sat in my wallet, tucked behind expired gift cards and old receipts, easy to forget and even easier to dismiss. It didn't look special. No flashy logo. No raised numbers. Just a dull silver finish with my grandfather's name etched softly across the front. When he gave it to me, I assumed it was sentimental. Maybe a membership card to something outdated. Maybe a keepsake meant to make me smile years later. I never asked for details, and he never offered them. That was his way. Standing outside my parents' house that night, I pulled it out and held it under the porch light. It felt heavier than it should have. Not physically, but in meaning. His voice came back to me, steady and calm, telling me not to hesitate when the time came. I slid it back into my pocket without using it. Not yet. Something in me knew this wasn't a moment to act out of panic. Grandpa had never rushed decisions. He believed timing mattered more than force. Over the next few days, I bounced between couches and cheap motels, pretending everything was fine. I told friends I was figuring things out. I told myself the same thing. Each night, before I slept, I checked that the card was still there, like a promise I wasn't ready to open. I wondered how much of it was real and how much was just hope. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe it was nothing. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the look in my grandfather's eyes when he handed it to me, certain, almost protective. He'd known this day would come. Maybe not the details, but the feeling. Being underestimated. Being dismissed. Being pushed aside by people who should have stood with you. The card wasn't a solution. Not yet. It was something quieter. It was proof that someone had prepared for me long before I ever knew I'd need it, that I could have gone to the bank the very next morning. The thought crossed my mind more than once, especially during the long hours when I had nowhere to be and too much time to think. But something held me back, and it wasn't fear. Using the card felt permanent. Like opening a door that couldn't be closed again. My grandfather hadn't given it to me as an escape hatch for discomfort. He'd given it to me for a moment that mattered. Part of me wanted to prove I could survive without it. That I didn't need a dramatic reveal or hidden advantage to stand on my own. I found temporary work. I stayed quiet. I let the shock of being kicked out settle instead of reacting to it. There was also respect. Grandpa had trusted me with something he never explained. I didn't want to use it impulsively, out of anger or desperation. He'd been careful his entire life. I owed him the same restraint. Every day, I asked myself the same question: is this the moment? And every day, the answer was no. Then the doubt started creeping in. What if the card was symbolic? What if I'd misunderstood everything? I imagined walking into a bank and being laughed out of the building. The embarrassment alone was enough to make me hesitate. But each time I considered giving up on it completely, something stopped me. Not hope, certainty. A quiet, grounded sense that when the right moment came, it would be obvious. That moment didn't arrive in a rush. It came slowly, through exhaustion. Through realizing I wasn't meant to struggle just to prove a point. Through understanding that self-respect sometimes means accepting help when it's been deliberately set aside for you. One morning, after another night of restless sleep, I woke up knowing. Not because I was desperate. But because I was ready. I reached into my wallet, felt the edge of the silver card, and decided it was time to find out what my grandfather had really left me. The bank didn't look special from the outside. Just another brick building on a quiet street, wedged between a pharmacy and a dry cleaner. People walked in and out without urgency, carrying folders and coffee cups, living normal mornings. No one there knew who I was, or why my hands felt heavier than usual as I pushed the door open. Inside, everything smelled like paper and polished floors. The kind of place where voices stayed low and time moved slowly. I stood in line, listening to the soft beep of machines and the rustle of forms being passed back and forth. My heart wasn't racing. That surprised me. I felt calm, almost detached. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the counter and slid the card across without explanation. The teller glanced at it casually at first, the way you look at something you've seen 1,000 times before. Then she paused. She turned the card over once. Then again. Her expression shifted, not to shock, but to focus. She typed something into her computer, stopped, then typed again more carefully. The tapping slowed. Her shoulders straightened. "Just a moment," she said, suddenly polite in a way that felt rehearsed. She disappeared through a side door, taking the card with her. I stood there alone, the counter suddenly feeling too wide, the room too quiet. A few minutes passed. Then 5. I wondered if this was where reality would finally step in and tell me I'd imagined everything. Instead, a man in a dark suit approached. He introduced himself as the branch manager and asked me to follow him. His voice was steady, but his eyes lingered on the card in his hand longer than necessary. We walked past open desks into a private office. The door closed softly behind us. He gestured for me to sit, then sat across from me, folding his hands carefully on the desk. "I need to verify something," he said. "Before we continue." That was the moment it hit me. Not fear, clarity. Whatever this card was, it wasn't ordinary. And whatever my parents thought I had when they sent me away, they had missed something important. The manager turned his screen slightly away, picked up the phone, and made a call that would change everything I thought I knew about my grandfather, and myself. The manager didn't look at me when he ended the call. He stared at the screen, unmoving, like the numbers had stopped making sense. His jaw tightened, then relaxed, then tightened again. Whatever he was seeing wasn't what he expected. He cleared his throat and asked me to confirm my name. Then my date of birth. Then my grandfather's full legal name. Each question came slower than the last, as if he were stepping carefully through unfamiliar territory. I answered calmly, even though my palms had started to sweat. He typed again. This time, he didn't rush. Every keystroke was deliberate. When he finally leaned back in his chair, the room felt smaller. He glanced at the door, then stood and quietly locked it. "I'm going to ask you to be patient with me," he said. His tone had changed completely. Not friendly. Not distant. Careful. Respectful. I nodded, unsure what patience even meant in this moment. He picked up the phone again, dialed a different number, and spoke in low, precise sentences I couldn't hear clearly. Words like verification, legacy account, and authorization drifted across the desk. When he hung up, his hands weren't shaking, but they weren't steady either. He finally looked at me, really looked at me, like he was seeing me for the first time. The casual professionalism was gone. In its place was something closer to disbelief. "I need to apologize," he said slowly. "This isn't something we see often. In fact, most people don't even know accounts like this exist." I didn't respond. I didn't know how. He turned the monitor slightly, then stopped himself, turning it back again. "Before I show you anything," he added, "there are protocols. Security steps. Legal confirmations." That word, legal, hung in the air. He stood up and paced once behind his desk, then sat again, exhaling through his nose. "Your grandfather," he said carefully, "was not who your family thought he was." The sentence landed heavier than any number ever could. In that moment, I realized the card wasn't just access. It was a key. And my grandfather hadn't hidden something small. He had hidden something massive. And whatever was about to be revealed, it was already too late for anyone to pretend I didn't matter. The manager stood up again, this time without hesitation. He opened the office door and glanced down the hallway, checking who might be watching. Then he looked back at me. "Can you come with me, please?" he asked, already gesturing forward. We didn't walk back toward the lobby. Instead, we moved deeper into the building, past offices with frosted glass and doors marked authorized personnel only. Each step made the situation feel less theoretical and more real. Whatever this was, it had crossed a line most customers never even approached. He swiped a badge and opened another door, leading me into a smaller conference room. No windows. Thicker walls. A long table with only 2 chairs. He pulled one out for me, waited until I sat, then closed the door behind us carefully. "This is standard procedure," he said, though his voice suggested it wasn't standard at all. "For accounts of this nature." That phrase again. Of this nature. He placed the silver card on the table between us, aligning it perfectly with the edge like it deserved precision. Then he slid a folder toward me. It was thin, but the paper inside looked official in a way that made my stomach tighten. "I need to be very clear," he continued. "Nothing you're about to see leaves this room until verification is complete. Not to your family. Not to anyone. Family." The word felt strange here, spoken in this context. I nodded, my voice caught somewhere between curiosity and disbelief. He took a breath, steadied himself, and opened the folder. I saw seals. Signatures. Dates that stretched back further than I expected. "Your grandfather," he said quietly, "established this structure decades ago. Multiple institutions. Multiple safeguards." He paused, looking up at me again, as if gauging whether I was ready for what came next. Then he added, "And you are the sole authorized successor." In that moment, the room felt very still. Not empty. Not quiet. Just waiting. Waiting for the number that would finally explain why my grandfather had told me not to hesitate, and why my parents had been so confident I had nothing at all. The manager turned the monitor toward me slowly, like he was giving the information time to breathe before it reached me. At first, my eyes didn't register what I was looking at. Just rows. Columns. A clean, minimalist interface that felt strangely calm for what it was holding. Then I saw the number. I blinked once. Then again. My brain refused to connect meaning to it. There were too many zeros. Too many commas. The figure didn't feel real, it felt like something from a headline or a rumor, not something attached to my name. The manager watched my reaction closely but didn't interrupt. He let the silence do the work. "This is a consolidated total," he said finally, his voice low. "Assets held across multiple trusts, investment vehicles, and accounts. Conservative valuation." Conservative. I swallowed. My mouth had gone dry. "That can't be right," I said quietly, not because I didn't believe him, but because believing it felt dangerous. He nodded, like he'd expected that response. "That's what most people say." He pointed to a smaller line beneath the total. "My grandfather's name." Then another line below it. "Mine." The number sat beside it, $1.2 billion. Not potential. Not projected. Existing. For the first time since I'd walked into the bank, my chest tightened. Not with excitement, but with weight. This wasn't just money. It was history. Decisions layered over decades. Silence chosen intentionally. The manager leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Your grandfather was extremely private. He structured everything to remain invisible unless absolutely necessary. No flashy transfers. No public filings that could be traced easily." I thought of his old car. His worn watch. The way he'd changed the subject whenever money came up. It wasn't modesty. It was camouflage. You're not required to do anything today, the manager continued. Access can be phased. Advisors can be appointed. Security protocols established. I barely heard him. All I could think about was my parents' certainty as they'd handed me that empty suitcase. The confidence in their voices when they decided I had nothing worth worrying about. They hadn't just underestimated me. They'd misunderstood my grandfather completely. The manager turned the screen back toward himself and stood up, suddenly formal again. There will be calls, he said. From legal teams. From institutions you've never heard of. He paused at the door, then added, almost gently, and from people who realize too late that they made a mistake. As the door closed behind him, I stared at the space where the number had been. And understood, for the first time, why my grandfather had told me not to hesitate. Some truths are too big to reveal casually. And some silences are worth billions. As the shock settled, the manager began explaining what the number actually represented. Not all at once, carefully, like he was unpacking something fragile. My grandfather hadn't built wealth in loud ways. There were no headlines, no public companies with his name attached. Everything had been intentional, layered, and quiet. He started decades ago. Early investments when industries were still dismissed as risky. Stakes in companies before they became familiar names. Long-term positions held through downturns that scared other people away. While others chased fast money, my grandfather waited. Time did the heavy lifting. But it wasn't just investing. He'd built structures, trusts within trusts, each designed to protect the next. Assets were separated, insulated, and managed independently. If one failed, the others wouldn't even notice. It wasn't paranoia. It was foresight. The manager explained how my grandfather insisted on privacy above everything else. No shared accounts. No visible paper trail connecting him to the full picture. Even family members only saw what he wanted them to see, which, apparently, was very little. That part didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was learning that my grandfather had been watching all along. He'd received reports. Updates. Assessments. Not just about markets, but about me. My education. My work. My decisions. He'd never interfered. Never corrected my path. He just observed. He believed in autonomy, the manager said. He wanted to see who you became without influence. Suddenly, so many small moments made sense. The questions he'd asked. The way he listened without guiding. The trust he'd placed in me long before I'd earned it. When the time came, he didn't leave instructions for my parents. Or for lawyers to explain things gently. He left one card, and one condition. That I decide when to use it. The manager slid another document across the table. My grandfather's signature sat at the bottom, steady and unmistakable. Next to it was a note written in smaller print. Release access only when the successor stands alone. I stared at the words longer than anything else that day. Being kicked out hadn't disqualified me. It had activated everything. My grandfather hadn't prepared me to be rescued. He'd prepared me to be free. The first call came before I even left the bank. I didn't recognize the number, and for once, I didn't feel the urge to answer immediately. I watched the phone vibrate on the table, face down, like it already knew its timing was bad. The manager noticed and gave a small nod. It's starting, he said. By the time I stepped outside, the air felt different. Heavier. My phone lit up again, this time with a voicemail notification. Then another missed call. And another. The pattern was sudden and frantic, nothing like the silence I'd grown used to. I didn't need to listen to know who it was. Somewhere between legal departments and account verifications, my parents' names had surfaced. Not because I'd mentioned them, but because institutions that had once ignored them were now calling with questions they couldn't answer. They had told people I was unstable, dependent, not ready. Now banks were asking why they weren't listed anywhere. The first message from my mother came through as text. Short. Casual. Too casual. Are you okay? Call me. No apology. No explanation. Just concern, carefully worded to sound loving instead of alarmed. My father called next. Left a voicemail. His voice was tight, controlled, like he was negotiating instead of asking. He said there had been a misunderstanding. That someone from a financial office had reached out and used my name. That it was probably a mistake. It wasn't. More calls followed. Numbers I didn't recognize. Lawyers. Advisors. People who suddenly wanted to clarify relationships. Every message carried the same quiet panic beneath polite language. What struck me most wasn't the urgency. It was the timing. No one had checked on me the night I left. No one had asked where I slept. No one had offered help when I had nothing but a suitcase and pride. But now that something valuable had been revealed, now that silence had become expensive, my existence mattered again. I didn't return any of the calls that day. Not out of spite. Not out of anger. But because for the first time, I wasn't reacting to them. They were reacting to me. And that shift, small, invisible, irreversible, was something my parents had never planned for. They had kicked me out believing I'd disappear. Instead, I had become unavoidable. They didn't call before coming. They just appeared, standing on the sidewalk outside the small apartment I'd moved into temporarily, looking uncertain in a way I'd never seen before. My mother clutched her purse with both hands. My father kept adjusting his jacket, like he wasn't sure how formal this meeting was supposed to be. I didn't open the door right away. I watched them through the peephole for a moment, not out of cruelty, but curiosity. This was the first time they'd ever come to me without instructions prepared. When I finally stepped outside, my mother smiled too quickly. "We just wanted to talk," she said, as if that hadn't been an option weeks ago. My father cleared his throat and jumped in. He said there had been confusion. That people had called asking strange questions. That my grandfather's name had come up in places it never had before. He spoke carefully, choosing words like clarify and straighten things out, avoiding anything that sounded like an apology. They didn't ask how I was doing. Not really. They asked where I was staying. Who I'd been speaking to. Whether I'd signed anything. I told them I was fine. The relief on their faces was immediate, but it wasn't relief about my well-being. It was relief that I was still accessible. Still reachable. My mother tried a different approach. She said families go through rough patches. That emotions had been high. That they'd always wanted what was best for me. The same phrases I'd heard my entire life, recycled now with softer edges. I listened without interrupting. I didn't correct them. I didn't explain myself. The silence did more work than any argument ever had. Finally, my father asked the question they'd both been circling. "Is there something we should know about?" he said. I met his eyes and answered honestly. "There are a lot of things you don't know about me." They waited for more. I gave them nothing. For the first time, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't seeking approval or forgiveness. I wasn't afraid of disappointing them. They had come expecting control. They left realizing they no longer had any. And as I watched them walk away, slower, quieter, uncertain, I understood something clearly. Being underestimated had always protected me. Now, it protected my peace. I didn't set the boundary in a dramatic moment. There was no raised voice, no list of grievances laid out like evidence. It happened quietly, the way most permanent things do. A few days after my parents showed up, my phone rang again. This time, I answered. My mother's voice softened immediately, careful and rehearsed. She talked about starting over. About fixing things. About how everything that happened had been a misunderstanding fueled by stress. I let her finish. Then I told her, calmly, that I wouldn't be explaining my life to them anymore. That my finances, my decisions, and my future were no longer topics for family discussion. That if they wanted a relationship, it would exist without control, conditions, or leverage. There was a pause on the line. Not shock, calculation. My father took over the call. He said they were just trying to protect me. That families don't keep secrets from each other. That shutting them out would only cause more distance. That distance already exists, I replied. I didn't create it. I just stopped pretending it wasn't there. I told them I wasn't angry. And I meant it. Anger would have kept me tied to the old dynamic. This was different. This was clarity. I explained what would happen next. We could talk occasionally. We could meet in neutral places. But there would be no financial involvement. No advice unless I asked. No decisions made for me. If they crossed those lines, I would step back without explanation. They didn't argue after that. Not because they agreed, but because they understood something had shifted permanently. The leverage they once relied on was gone. When the call ended, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. For the first time, I wasn't negotiating my place in their lives. I was defining it. And whether they accepted those terms or not no longer felt like something I needed to control. That, more than any number on a screen, was real wealth. Because boundaries don't punish others. They protect you. For a long time, I thought being kicked out was a punishment. A consequence meant to teach me humility, obedience, fear. That's how my parents framed it, and for a while, I almost believed them. Almost. But standing where I am now, I see it differently. Being forced out stripped away the last illusion I was holding on to, the belief that I needed their approval to move forward. When the door closed behind me that night, it didn't just end a chapter. It freed me from waiting for permission I was never going to receive. What my grandfather left me wasn't just money. It was intent. He didn't step in to save me when things were hard. He waited until I stood on my own, until I understood who I was without protection, without validation, without a safety net I could lean on too early. That mattered. The wealth changed my options, but it didn't change my values. I didn't rush to upgrade my life overnight. I didn't announce anything. I kept my routine simple, my circle small, my silence intact. For the first time, I was choosing my life instead of reacting to it. My parents still don't fully understand what happened. They know enough to be careful now. Enough to realize that control no longer works the way it used to. Whether they ever understand why things changed isn't something I lose sleep over. What I gained was more important than their understanding. I gained the ability to walk away from conversations that diminish me. The confidence to say no without explaining myself. The peace of knowing that my worth was never tied to how useful I was to someone else. If they hadn't kicked me out, I might have stayed comfortable. I might have kept shrinking, convincing myself that loyalty meant endurance. I might never have learned how powerful quiet independence can be. My grandfather knew that comfort can delay growth. So he didn't give me a rescue. He gave me a moment. A moment where I had to choose myself without applause, without certainty, without guarantees. And when I did, everything else followed. They thought they were pushing me out into nothing. Instead, they pushed me into my own life. And that's something no one can ever take back.